Thinking about it, this might be a little extreme, but kind of asking a very simple question: what is phenomenology? And then I'm also defending the thesis throughout the book in this paper that maybe phenomenology has never existed. So I'll start. Discontent with the legacy of the linguistic turn, which we heard about in the last paper, and eager to bring the discourse of the end of metaphysics to an end, continental philosophy has in recent years taken a speculative turn, as we know. The speculative turn is marked by a desire to bring ontology back into the spotlight of philosophy and to establish new forms of realism and materialism. We've heard this narrative a million times. And to revitalize metaphysics after its suspension by phenomenology and its offshoots, hermeneutics and deconstruction. But does metaphysics really come to an end with phenomenology? Does phenomenology actually get us back to the things themselves as it claims? Or does it just offer us a semblance of realism, which is to say, no realism at all? My contention is that phenomenology has shown itself to do two incompatible things. On the one hand, it offers us a quasi or a pseudo-realism, free of metaphysical commitments. Secondly, it makes metaphysical realist commitments that transgress its methodological boundaries. So I'm interested in the method of phenomenology and with the boundary of that method. But I think phenomenologists can be seen to be doing two things. Like I said, drawing a limit to what can be said with phenomenology, but then also crossing that limit, and that's what I'm interested in. I think this incompatibility or this contradiction results because phenomenology lacks a consistent methodology after Husserl. So if it's realism that we're interested in getting, there are better places than phenomenology to find it, and I think speculative realism is one of those places. Not the only place, but it's one of those places. Okay, so not all variants or species of speculative realism borrow from the literature of phenomenology, but they all do share the phenomenological aspiration to engage reality on its own terms. But can this aspiration be fulfilled by phenomenology? This question, I think, provokes the question of method. What is the method of phenomenology, and what can it get us realism? That's my question. What is phenomenology, and can it be realist? Now, on the face of it, both phenomenology and speculative realism take continental philosophy onto the road out of Kantian idealism, which is one of the species of what the speculative realists call correlationism, and into what Kenton Meillassoux calls the great outdoors of realism. Throughout the 20th century, phenomenology promised to get us, quote-unquote, back to the things themselves. That is, back in touch with the world of lived experience as it's lived. But what phenomenology actually delivers is a subtler version of the Kantian world for us, rather than the world in itself. It does not get us the world of real things or the world of material things as they are in themselves. Phenomenology does not get us to the noumenal or the essence of things. Instead, it keeps us, as I'd say, chained to the phenomenal where we have been all along. Despite appearances, only speculative realism can actually get us out of Kant's shadow. Now, how it does so is a question I'm not going to answer in this paper. And I think after Pete's presentation a few days ago, we have reason to believe that maybe it doesn't actually get us out of Kant's shadow, but that's a different discussion. So if speculative realism is going to get us away from Kantianism or get us out of correlationism, this requires a radically different method than the one that we get introduced by Husserl and the method that's modified by his descendants, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, and so forth. For anyone searching for a realist alternative to the Kantian program, phenomenology is a kind of dead end, I think, that leaves its practitioners gesturing toward the outside without ever getting us to the outside. This paper explores the problem of defining the method of phenomenology and suggests that it's a kind of rhetoric of concreteness, that I call it, that gives phenomenology a kind of feel of realism without actually giving us metaphysical realism. So this, in one of the chapters in the book, it deals with this notion of what I call the rhetoric of concreteness. I think there's a lot of rhetorical tropes that you find recurring in phenomenology that make what phenomenology does feel like it's metaphysical realism, or that it gets us something like realism. But once again, I think it only feels like realism. It's not actually a kind of philosophically justifiable realism. So it would be inaccurate to claim that either phenomenology or speculative realism adheres to a standard or singular method. We know there's lots of diversity amongst the various phenomenologists, just like there's a lot of methodological diversity amongst the speculative realist and object-oriented ontologist, new materialists. The various figures gathered under the speculative realist label deploy disparate or divergent methodologies, although each in their own way attempts to overcome the anti-realist hegemony in continental philosophy. Toward this end, they share a willingness to speculate about things that are metaphysical, and some speculative realists more than others, to construct original ontologies. This compels the speculative realist to reach beyond the finite limits of perception, history, and language. This is a very difficult challenge. Another thing shared by the multiple species or variants of speculative realism is a rejection of the ontological primacy of the correlation of thought and being. A rejection or a kind of encounter with correlationism. Not all of them reject the legitimacy of correlationism as such, but all speculative realists agree that there is much more to the real than what appears to human consciousness, hence the interest in the inhuman or the non-human, and so forth. There is, however, much disagreement about just how to characterize the real or the reality. Phenomenology, by contrast, is exclusively committed to investigating only those dimensions of human experience that take shape within the correlation of thought and being. To be sure, it explicitly, phenomenology explicitly focuses philosophy's lens on what is evidenced within the correlation. Although each phenomenologist assumes this task in their own idiosyncratic way, each one is bound to the method of phenomenology, which, however it is construed, eschews metaphysical speculation. So one of the fundamental gestures of the phenomenological method, from what I can tell in all of its variations, is this unwillingness to speculate about metaphysics. It's their way of sort of changing the rules of the game of philosophy. We no longer talk about metaphysics, we have a different way of doing philosophy, and we begin there. Unlike speculative realism, phenomenology purports to practice something called phenomenology, while few, if any, speculative realists pledge their allegiance to some sort of singular speculative realist methodology. Right? So even though you have methodology at work in speculative realism, it's different in Meillassoux or Brasier or Harman, Bogos. They all have different methods, so they don't all claim to be practicing something called speculative realism, even though they're all called speculative realists. By contrast, the phenomenologists all claim to be practicing phenomenology, and my claim is that if that's not a reference to the method that they're using, that derives from Husserl, then what does it mean to even call yourself a phenomenologist? We'll see what you think about this. Despite their resolution to speak only of what's evidenced in the correlation of consciousness and world or thought and being, it's not difficult to find a phenomenologist making metaphysical assertions. Even Husserl and Heidegger make metaphysical claims that are not legitimated by phenomenological evidence. They make these metaphysical claims. Phenomenologically speaking, these claims are illegitimate precisely because phenomenology is supposed to be metaphysically neutral on the existence of the things of the world. This is the meaning of the methodological device known as the phenomenological epoche, the suspension or bracketing of the material world, which is Husserl's analog to the radical methodological doubt that we find in Descartes' Meditations. The epoche does not force the phenomenologist to actually doubt the existence of the world as it appears to consciousness, but merely prevents her from making any assertion about the objective existence of the things of the world. As such, the phenomenological method cannot be metaphysically realist because it doesn't make the claim to be realist or anti-realist. It tries to avoid this duality. Such assertions, I suggest, are akin to non sequiturs in the sense that they do not follow from, or are not supported by, or are not justified by phenomenological method. So, just as the empiricist method of Hume in a text like Of Miracles could never justify a commitment to the existence of miracles, phenomenology cannot justify commitments to what is not disclosed phenomenologically. And much of what realism is committed to is never disclosed phenomenologically. This is not to say that a transcendental phenomenologist is not permitted to hold realist commitments. What I mean is that those commitments are not the product of the phenomenological method or phenomenological description. So I don't know if this is useful, but I make a distinction between phenomenologists, people who are called phenomenologists, and phenomenology. So, for instance, Merleau-Ponty is a phenomenologist, and I think there's a kind of mistaken view that everything Merleau-Ponty writes is phenomenology. So if he writes a shopping list before he goes to the grocery store, this is phenomenology, because it's written by a phenomenologist. I don't think that's right. That's wrong. Phenomenology, I contend, this is my thesis, must lead necessarily to either anti-realism or a kind of metaphysical agnosticism. It therefore cannot be realist because its method prohibits the kind of speculation required for grounding realism in philosophical argument. This kind of speculation we get in speculative realism. Whatever we think of it, it's at least attempted there. Now, Husserl founded the phenomenological movement by perpetually writing and rewriting and beginning to write books and lectures that would define the precise principles of the phenomenological method and shape it into what he called rigorous science. It's now commonplace to actually point to this constant rewriting and rethinking, to epitomize or characterize Husserl's work in essence, or to characterize phenomenology's approach to philosophy, right? You might ask the question, what is phenomenology? And the answer is, it's a constant return to the question of what phenomenology is, and the question of the epoche, the question of the reduction, and trying to think about what this reduction is, and whether or not it's possible. And that's what phenomenology does. It's constantly returning to the beginnings of experience, the beginning of philosophy, and interrogating that foundation. It's often regarded as one of phenomenology's virtues, right? Even today, the critical edge of phenomenology is lauded, or it's praised as a kind of perpetual self-rejuvenation, for which phenomenology is ready to ransom all the prestige attached to a mature, tried and tested doctrine. Husserl was never satisfied with the presentation of phenomenology, which means that would-be phenomenologists today are left without a definitive statement of how properly to conduct a phenomenological investigation. They're likewise without a proper understanding of how far phenomenology can take us toward solving the classical problems of philosophy. This is no doubt a crucial reason for the methodological disparity amongst phenomenologists. Nevertheless, it must be possible to establish at least what Husserl considered the necessary elements of phenomenological method, however minimal these elements must be. Without these basic elements of what the phenomenological method is, I want to ask, is it possible to know how to practice phenomenology? If the method of phenomenology is uncertain, it is difficult to see how its results could be reliable, let alone rigorously scientific. As Husserl writes, quote, only a positive criticism of principles of method can give us confidence in the possibility of a scientific philosophy. Now, if Husserl saw this clearly, his followers remain less concerned about securing the integrity of their method. Many since Husserl have asked about the meaning of phenomenology. Still, however, no consensus exists, and methodologically speaking, this is phenomenology's fateful, I think, perhaps fatal vice, not a virtue. So, can you hear okay? Yeah. I can hear him too. Everything's okay? I don't trust technology at conferences. It always fails people. Husserl's descendants, people working in Husserl's tradition, often the most prominent, people like Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger and Levinas and Marion, Henri, and so forth, they rarely take his efforts to establish the science of phenomenology as seriously as he did. As the Irish philosopher Dermot Moran has noted, and this he follows Paul Ricoeur, Moran says, and this is a quote, phenomenology is the story of the deviations from Husserl. The history of phenomenology is the history of Husserlian heresies, end of quote. Now, Husserl's followers interpret and apply phenomenology as they wish, often preferring to reroute it down a less scientific, more existential path. It's generally reconceived as the philosophy that dispenses or does away with abstractions in order to get us back in touch with what it's like to live and think in the real world. Some phenomenologists like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, they outright reject the idea of phenomenology as a strict philosophical method. But if it's not a method, then what is it? Right, that's my question. If phenomenology is not a method, then what is it? More than 40 years after Husserl published Logical Investigations in 1900-1901, Merleau-Ponty expressed wonder at that this question, what is phenomenology, is still unanswered. So he took the opportunity to once again define phenomenology, as Heidegger and others had done before him. In the preface to the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty decides that phenomenology, it's not really a method. Instead, it's a style of philosophy. This is a quote from Merleau-Ponty. He says, the opinion of the responsible philosopher must be that phenomenology can be practiced and identified as a manner or a style of thinking. That it existed as a movement before arriving at a complete awareness of itself as philosophy. End of quote. If it does not render meaningless the allegiance, if it does not render meaningless the allegiance to phenomenology, an interpretation like this definitely calls into question the integrity of the phenomenologist method, even as it insists that phenomenology is accessible only through a phenomenological method. Yeah, so this is Merleau-Ponty as well. He says, as I quoted him, he says, phenomenology is a manner or a style of thinking, right? But then he also says that phenomenology can only be practiced, or it's only accessible through the phenomenological method, right? So you have this shift in the phenomenology of perception, where Merleau-Ponty wants to characterize phenomenology as less of a rigorous science, less of a strict method, and more of a way or a style of doing phenomenology. But at the same time, in the very same text, he says that phenomenology can only be accessed through a phenomenological method. So it's an interesting sort of, not a contradiction, but it's at least something to think about. This basically casts phenomenology's net too wide, I think. By calling it a style, too many people will then count as phenomenologists. And it does little to prevent us from gathering a whole range of philosophers and non-philosophers, and perhaps anti-philosophers, under the umbrella of phenomenology, whether they self-identify as phenomenologists or not. So whether or not somebody calls themselves a phenomenologist is irrelevant to whether or not they are a phenomenologist, right? If we call it a style of thinking, then many people can be phenomenologists. It allows us to, this is a kind of joke, it allows someone like Dermot Moran to say that Hannah Arendt is one of the important figures in the phenomenological movement, despite the fact that Arendt, and this is Moran's quote, she exhibited no particular interest in the phenomenological method and contributed nothing to the theory of phenomenology, and yet she's a phenomenologist. That's what Moran says. So for Moran, it's not enough that Arendt's work is, or as he puts it, can be fruitfully understood as a species of phenomenology. This is only possible, however, because Moran himself, vaguely and typically, I think many people who try to explain today what phenomenology is, they define it as this is his term, an anti-traditional style of philosophizing which emphasizes the attempt to get to the truth of matters, to describe phenomena in the broadest sense as whatever appears in the manner in which it appears. That is, as it manifests itself to consciousness, to the experiencer. So this idea from Moran that phenomenology, if you ask Moran what is phenomenology, his answer is it's an anti-traditional style of philosophizing which it emphasizes the attempt to get to the truth of matters and describe phenomena. Okay, so phenomenology wants to get to the truth of matters and wants to get to the truth of the matter through description of phenomena, what appears as it appears. So, I think this is a very vague definition of phenomenology, and vagueness of this kind does not help us understand what makes phenomenology unique amongst philosophy, and in fact seems to include or implicate more than one school of philosophy, as well as some other fields of inquiry, like ethnography, for instance. So I want to ask, what's the difference between an ethnographer and a phenomenologist? Dermot Moran's definition, along with many others that we find in the secondary literature, has a kind of post hoc ring to it. It seems motivated in part by a desire to have the definition apply to anyone who has been called a phenomenologist, as well as many people who have not been called phenomenologists. On this definition, we could include, and this is another little joke, on this definition we could call Herman Melville a phenomenologist of whaling, right? or Henry David Thoreau a phenomenologist of walking and living in cabins in the woods. Right? Or Foucault, a phenomenologist of power, right? A post hoc definition of phenomenology cannot satisfy the demands of method. And the method needs to be worked out prior to the study it's meant to guide. Now, nearly all of the major... maybe you're finding I have a very conservative view of what phenomenology is or what it should be, but that's maybe something we could talk about. Nearly all of the major phenomenologists see phenomenology as a method, which means they see it as directed by a certain set of principles or attitudes that circumscribe its practice. This view is shared by Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Levinas, Ricoeur, Marion, and many others. Even in their disagreement about what precisely is entailed by phenomenology, they recognize that liberties cannot be taken when trying to pin down a philosophical method without compromising the very integrity of that method. A method is supposed to rein in or keep at bay spurious conjecture and speculative impulses, and not send out various search teams in every possible direction. Without a clear method, we are not unlike, as Descartes says, this is a quote from Descartes, someone who's consumed with such senseless desire to discover treasure that he continually roams the streets to see if he can find any that a passerby might have dropped. End of quote. So a trustworthy method is necessary if we wish to be more than fortunate in our philosophical investigations. If we want to have control of the investigations and rather than leave ourselves up to chance in discovering truth in these investigations, then we should have a clear method that guides our philosophical studies. So my question is, what exactly is a method? And I take the definition from Descartes because I think it's sufficient for our purposes, but maybe we can talk about other ways of conceiving method. So in the rule number 4 of Descartes' Rules for the Direction of the Mind, he says, and this is important because Husserl's conception of method points us back to Descartes' conception of method. So methodologically, Husserl understands method through the lens of Descartes, right? Hence Cartesian meditations. So Descartes says this in the Rules for the Direction of the Mind. He says, by a method, this is a definition, by a method, I mean reliable rules which are easy to apply and such that if one follows them exactly, one will never take what is false to be true or fruitlessly expend one's mental efforts, but will gradually and constantly increase one's knowledge till one arrives at a true understanding of everything within one's capacity. Right? So the point of this definition that I think is useful is this idea of a reliable set of simple rules that guide our investigation. And I think when Husserl articulates things like the epoche or the various reductions and things like free imaginative variation, these sort of tools of the phenomenologist, I think he's trying to fulfill this need that Descartes articulates here. So in one sense, a method is about conserving our energy and ensuring the efficiency of our investigations, guaranteeing the accuracy of our results, and growing our knowledge. In another sense, method is about restricting what can and cannot be said, what counts as a legitimate statement and what does not. So my idea is that the method helps us figure out what we're justified in asserting or justified in concluding, right? And it keeps us from making claims that are unjustified or unjustifiable. That's part of the purpose of the method. So it sets a limit on the kinds of statements that we could make about reality, say. Right? So when the psychologist the behaviorist John Watson, for example, lays down the methodological guidelines for behaviorist psychology, he explicitly puts the domain of introspection, right? Introspection out of play from the behaviorist standpoint. So the behaviorist is forbidden, right? The behaviorist is forbidden forbidden to talk about introspection, like William James talks about introspection all the time. Yeah, the behaviorist says psychologists are not allowed to talk about introspection. This is one of the rules of the method. This is why we should and would be suspicious if a behaviorist like Watson were to begin talking about the mental life the way that, say, William James does, right? It is precisely the prohibition against this kind of talk that not only defines Watson's method, but also provokes someone like William James or Merleau-Ponty to devise a new approach to account for the complexity of human behavior, one that allows him to say more about mental life than the behaviorist is allowed to. This is one way to think about method. This is another way to think about method. Method is a kind of device that enables its followers to make statements that are not authorized for non-followers of the method. So let me just say that one more time. A method is a kind of device that allows its followers to make statements that cannot be made by its non-followers because they have a different method. And to be clear, it's neither authority nor power that authorizes these statements. It is the method itself. It's the rules and the way one follows the rules. A method opens up a new domain of speech or statements, and it's precisely what guarantees the legitimacy or the justification of that speech. Husserl is no foreigner, as I said, to Cartesian method, which clearly instructs us to order our thoughts and stick to our principles when attempting to extract the truth of experience. For the phenomenologist, not unlike Descartes himself, legitimacy or justification is garnered or gained by the fulfillment of an intention in experience underwritten by the certainty or givenness of subjectivity. Husserl's phenomenology develops in response to a perceived, as he puts it, crisis in the sciences and in philosophy. The crisis is the result of a certain, as he puts it, corruption, that's his word, corruption, of existence, of the spirit of humanity in early 20th century Europe. The corrupting force for Husserl is what he calls the exteriorization of reason in the naturalistic objectivist sciences that dominate the science of his day. Naturalism attempts to subject every domain of existence to the rigor of mathematical science, and ideally limits the sayable to the language of mathematics. Right? Ultimately, mathematics tells us what's real. At the heart of this crisis is the Cartesian conviction that everything, including human consciousness, can be quantified and thereby understood, the dream of a mathesis universalis. Phenomenological method for Husserl is supposed to resolve this crisis by humbling the tendencies of naturalism and calling radically into question the presuppositions of objectivist sciences and philosophy. Phenomenology is the kind of antidote, then, to the naturalism that alienates the immortal human spirit, this is Husserl, by reducing it to third-person, objective, natural, mathematical knowledge. But this antidote cannot be administered without first neutralizing the philosophical foundation of dualistic naturalism, namely the view that both nature and spirit are realities in the same sense. For Husserl, only spirit is truly real in the sense of autonomous in itself and for itself. Nature, by contrast, is the product of the spirit that studies it. Only once the neutralization of naive naturalism is accomplished can the essence of spirit be reclaimed from the clutches of barbaric naturalism. Transcendental phenomenology is the only method equipped for the scientific study of spirit or mind, right, consciousness, and the legitimation of the statements made about spirit, about nature, and their internal relation, or the correlation between them. Here I'll talk about Heidegger for a minute. In an exposition of the meaning of the phrase "to the matters" or "to the things themselves," found in a 1925 lecture course, History of the Concept of Time, which is a kind of first draft of Being in Time, Heidegger attempts to pinpoint the meaning of phenomenological method. He's obviously attempting to characterize phenomenology, and as someone grappling with the prospect of phenomenology as a method, he helps us get a kind of understanding of what Husserl was up to in his attempt to burrow beneath the method of naturalism, which in his view brought about the crisis to which phenomenology is the only philosophical response. For Heidegger, right? So for Heidegger, method is one of the basic components of what he calls a principle of research. It is, this is a quote, "It is the principle of developing the way of dealing with a subject or a subject matter," end of quote. It's clear that for Heidegger, the way of dealing with the matters themselves, which is the most general object of phenomenological research, is not via a constructive or a speculative path. This way, is, as he puts it, is groundless, is his term. Speculation, right, is groundless. A grounded approach, by contrast, is one that, as he says, is autochthonously demonstrative, in which, as he puts it, this is a quote, lays the foundation for this demonstration. For phenomenology, the demonstrable, or what can be demonstrated, is what is evidenced in the phenomena themselves, not what is deduced from the idea of the things themselves, or from the idea of phenomenology. Phenomenology is not a deductive method, but, as it were, this is a kind of word I'm applying here, maybe improperly, it's kind of adductive method, ADD, deductive method, in the sense that it adduces rather than deduces the matters themselves through concrete lived experience and its description. So the matters themselves are the source of the method, as it were. This principle of research is not plucked out of thin air, as Heidegger insists, but it is, as he puts it, and this is a quote, gleaned from its concretion in the research work itself. So the method comes out of the research itself. For Husserl, as well as Heidegger, this is examined in a different chapter in the book, we do this by focusing on their term, the concrete things, and we're led back into the ground of experience. We lay open the foundation of experience, and we're ultimately referred to the dimension of intentionality. Intentionality forms the subject matter of phenomenological research, or in Heidegger's words, quote, phenomenology is the analytic description of intentionality in its a priori, end of quote. Phenomenology then is a transcendental investigation into the ground of the matters themselves as they give themselves, for Husserl and for Heidegger in this text. It's thus a methodological term inasmuch as it is only used to designate the mode of experience, apprehension, and determination of that which is thematized in philosophy. Heidegger eventually drops or turns away from all intensive study of the conception of method. There's more than a little irony in the fact that Husserl worked tirelessly to crystallize a method that would avoid needless philosophical toil, only to come up short and have his project pushed ahead only in spirit, but nowhere near the letter and to the rigor that he demanded. Few people today see phenomenology as a scientific endeavor, and only some as a propedeutic to science. It's no longer apparent how phenomenology is to be carried out, or how it differs from, say, thick or rich empirical description, or even poetic embellishment. This is not to say that phenomenology can be reduced to mere rhetoric, or to claim that phenomenology has never achieved a coherent approach to philosophical problems, but to suggest that perhaps its meaning has proliferated beyond coherence, rendering phenomenology such a diluted term that any activity could qualify as phenomenological in nature. Are you tired yet? You okay? Okay. Yeah, so many practices and inquiries are called phenomenological, but like the term game, to use Wittgenstein's example, a refined definition that covers them all seems to be lacking. We don't have a precise definition of phenomenology, but we don't have one in the same way that we don't have a precise definition of what a game is, right, for Wittgenstein. This may not seem like a problem to anyone. It's probably it's likely only a problem to people like us. It may sound like a naive Socratic worry, right? Worrying about definitions, right? What is phenomenology? But in response, it is tempting to insist, or it's tempting for some people to insist that phenomenology doesn't have a strict, a precise definition. It's very thirsty. But maybe we want to call phenomenology what Wittgenstein calls a family resemblance term. Right? This would permit the practice of phenomenology to be as diverse as the various worlds that it tries to uncover. It would permit us to include in the canon of phenomenology people like Wittgenstein, Gilbert Ryle, Austin, Stanley Cavell, John McDowell, Hilary Putnam. Right? All of them, because each one of them bears a kind of methodological affinity with Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. Right? All these people might be called phenomenologists because there's something very similar amongst them, methodologically speaking. Now, the British philosopher Simon Glendinning argues for this in his book In the Name of Phenomenology, as does the French philosopher François-David Sebat in a book called Testing the Limits, and the American authors of a new book called The New Phenomenology, which is about the theological turn in phenomenology, Henri, Marion, Levinas, and so forth. Now, phenomenology, Glendinning says, is more about the method or the how than it is about the content or the what of the philosophy. It's not a set of doctrines. It's about paying closer attention to the appearances that present themselves to subjective experience. Now, how is this done? He doesn't tell us how this is done. How we pay closer attention to the appearances that present themselves to subjective experience, right? So if you read this book, In the Name of Phenomenology by Simon Glendinning, he asks himself the question, or asks us to consider the question, what is phenomenology? His answer is, it's not a set of doctrines, but it's about paying closer attention to the appearances as they present themselves. Okay. And then I have the question, okay, how do we do this in a precise or a philosophical or a rigorous way? And he doesn't answer that question. And I think this is typical of books that are written today that introduce people to what phenomenology is. They always ask the question on the first page, what is phenomenology? And they give a kind of vague answer like this, right? But one that allows them to include the familiar figures in phenomenology. But if I'm somebody who wants to take on phenomenology as a method for my research, I don't know, in the US at least, we have people who study sociology or rhetoric, communication, psychology, education, and they take on phenomenology as the method for studying those different fields. If you're going to study those fields from a phenomenological perspective, you should be able to find a book that tells you how you apply that method. But that's precisely in the literature what the authors often avoid doing. Because they don't, this is my contention, they don't want to define the method too precisely, because then it makes it seem like to be a phenomenologist you have to be like a fetishist about rules. And people don't like rules. And when you define, and this might be something we could talk about, and when you define the method of phenomenology too narrowly or too strictly, all of a sudden there are certain people that we call phenomenologists that aren't real, that no longer qualify as phenomenologists because they don't have a strict method. So this is, I don't know, this is how I, this is my survey of things. So Glendining's conclusion is that we should keep the definition of phenomenology skeletal, right, or very simple or general. I don't know, to avoid drawing too much attention to particular texts. Nevertheless, he enumerates three possible answers to the question of what the content of phenomenology is. First, he says, phenomenology is the legitimate heir to what used to be called philosophy. So we used to have philosophy, now we have phenomenology. Two, we might say phenomenology is the philosophical answer to modern scientific naturalism. Three, he says we might say that phenomenology is a work of convincing words that allows us to retrieve a radical understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. So phenomenology is one of these three things, or a little bit of each one of these three things. He doesn't say precisely. So instead of a singular definition of phenomenology, now we have three definitions of phenomenology, none of which spell out the methodological principles of what phenomenologists do. Socrates would not be pleased. The latter two formulations characterize phenomenology as basically an ideological reply to the worldview of techno-scientific rationality and culture. These capture the historical spirit of Husserl's motivation for founding phenomenology, but they do not clarify the nature of phenomenology as a philosophical practice. As for the first definition, it's fair enough to call phenomenology the future of philosophy after modernity, and this is what Husserl explicitly does in the Cartesian Meditations, but once again it does not specify what it takes to do phenomenology. Glendining's distillation of phenomenology is symptomatic as well as emblematic of the way that phenomenology has been dissociated from its method. Today, I think anything is called phenomenology so long as it involves some kind of subjective description of experience. As long as you're doing that in philosophy, you're a kind of phenomenologist. Note that in these three definitions that Glendining gives us, they don't represent phenomenology as fundamentally concerned with intuiting things like essences or noetic reduction or eidetic intuition, this vocabulary that we find in Husserl and others. It's not concerned with giving us the kind of essential structures of consciousness or intentionality, which someone might say, what's phenomenology? Well, it's that branch of philosophy that's interested in the structures of consciousness, right? That's one definition, but Glendinning does not include it. These days, there's a deep disagreement about how important this kind of Husserlian essentialism is to the phenomenological project. It's often ridiculed as merely a symptom of Husserl's latent modernism or his idealism, but it's still used to identify the work of phenomenology in individual thinkers. Whenever a philosopher pays especially close attention to a particular region of experience and attempts to lay out the essential features of that experience, this practice is often identified as phenomenology. The working assumption here is that this is what phenomenology does, or this is what phenomenology is. So when Dermot Moran again calls Hannah Arendt a phenomenologist of public space or publicness, he no doubt means that her work is remarkably attuned to public life and more than capable of extracting the essential features of what public life is. Nevertheless, Dan Zahavi's a Scandinavian phenomenologist. He points out, and this is a quote from Zahavi, this interest in essential structures is so widespread and common in the history of philosophy that it is nonsensical to take it as a defining feature of phenomenology. All philosophy is concerned with essential structures, is what Zahavi is saying. Or it's at least so common in philosophy that to say that that is what defines phenomenology, it doesn't make any sense. If phenomenology is about intuiting essences or something like that, as opposed to establishing facts like an empiricist, right, then it still remains to be asked how these essences are to be seen. How do we intuit these essences, if that's what phenomenology is about? It's arguable that Husserl was the only person who believed in essences and believed in our capacity to intuit these essences with anything like methodological rigor. So, if there's no singular methodological thread linking the practice of phenomenology, then what links phenomenologists together? If Merleau-Ponty is right to call phenomenology a style or a manner of thinking, right, then it's got to be a style, it has to be a style which allows the practitioner to, and this is a quote from Raymond Aron, as he says to Sartre, the quote, it's got to be a philosophy that talks about, let me start over. If phenomenology is a style of philosophy, then it's a style of philosophy that allows us to talk about this cocktail and make a philosophy out of it. Right? That's what phenomenology allows us to do. Now, anyone can talk about a cocktail. Right? William James can talk about a cocktail for sure, with all the poetry in his philosophy. He could talk philosophically about cocktails and beverages and tea, and Russian tea and English tea, but he's not considered a phenomenologist, right? William James isn't a phenomenologist, although the case has been made by a number of people that he should be included in the phenomenological movement. But this presents us with a kind of problem because William James was writing phenomenological texts before Husserl founded the method of phenomenology. So if William James can be a phenomenologist, then we can maybe find phenomenologists all the way back through the history of philosophy. Right? Then we have an interesting historical story to tell about phenomenology. So William James is not considered a phenomenologist, right? And no doubt it's his literary style, his poetic style, that affiliates him with phenomenology, which leads some people to think that phenomenology is just in a kind of poetry. His inclusion, however, really disrupts, as I said, the narrative of phenomenology, its birth and its life. It leads us to ask this question: if someone gives a description of the world, what makes that description phenomenological rather than just an everyday, ordinary description? For every philosophical description, we must provide some criteria that would enable us to differentiate the phenomenological from the non-phenomenological. And at this point, it's not clear what the difference is between phenomenology and non-phenomenology. Again, it's kind of a parallel concern to the earlier talk. Heidegger writes, and this is a quote from Heidegger, he says, phenomenological, this term, phenomenological, signifies everything that belongs to such a way of exhibiting phenomena and phenomenal structures, everything that becomes thematic in this kind of research. The unphenomenological or the non-phenomenological would be everything that does not satisfy this kind of research, its conceptuality, and its method of demonstration. End of the quote. So it's not even clear if such a circumscription of phenomenology and a differentiation from non-phenomenology is desirable for us, or if it's even useful for us. Do we even care about the difference between phenomenology and non-phenomenology? It's not even, at any rate, the burden of proof, I think, lies on the shoulders of anyone who holds that phenomenology actually exists as a coherent approach. So my view is that if you think that phenomenology exists, then it's your responsibility to give me a definition of what phenomenology is. And then we can see who counts as a phenomenologist and who doesn't. Okay? Okay, so I'm trying to go quickly. It's okay? Okay. I promise this has something to do with speculative realism eventually. Okay. We'll get to the end. This isn't a phenomenology conference. But I think I thank you for being patient with me talking so much about phenomenology. I've gotten a kind of reputation as a phenomenologist because I write a lot about phenomenology. But I don't know if this will translate, but I'm a frenemy of phenomenology. I'm a friend at the same time as an enemy of phenomenology. Right. I don't know where this word comes from. Mean Girls. It's Lindsay Lohan invented this word, frenemy. So I write a lot about phenomenology, but at the end of the day, I'm concerned with materialism and realism. But I think this kind of story about phenomenology helps us explain something about speculative realism. It helps us understand the different alternatives to realism, because I think in the 20th century, the impression was that if you wanted to be a realist, your only option for continental philosophy was phenomenology. And my suggestion is, not only is it not a good option for realism, it's not a realist option at all. We need some other sort of method if we want realism. Okay. So, if you look at analytic philosophy or philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition, you hear them calling phenomenology an enterprise that's as moribund or as dead as logical positivism, while countless figures writing in the wake of deconstruction treat it with the kind of contempt that Heideggerians reserve for Platonic ontotheology and Cartesian substance ontology. This attitude, I think, fails to appreciate the continuing vitality of phenomenology. So a lot of people think that phenomenology is kind of dead, but I think it's very, very much alive. People are writing new phenomenology. I know plenty of people that are using phenomenology as a method, like I said, for sociology or education or psychology or what have you. It's very much alive, and my question is, if analytic philosophers think it's dead, but it's actually very much alive, how do we reconcile this? I mean, it's an ideological issue, but how do people still get paid to be phenomenologists and write books that are phenomenological and they still get published? We have to explain why this happens, right? So it can't be dead. My way of talking about phenomenology is it's a zombie now. Phenomenology is undead. But the zombie doesn't know that they're dead. But they continue. That's zombie. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, I should say, the theological turn. We talked a little bit about this earlier, theological turn. Yes, oh no. See? The technology, it fails eventually. So I think the theological turn is a place where we see that phenomenology is still very much alive. There's a very rich and robust philosophical activity amongst theological phenomenologists like Henri, again, Henri, Marion, and so forth. Now, there's a lot at stake for the theological phenomenologists because they're interested in God. And if you're interested in God, presumably you're interested in God being real, right? That God actually exists in some sort of reality, right? There's a sort of reality to God. But if phenomenology cannot get us the reality of God, then that's a big failure for the theological phenomenologists. So there's a lot at stake for them in particular. They're not just talking about cups, they're talking about God, right? On the other hand, phenomenology is very much alive for people like Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Dan Zahavi, and Sean Gallagher, this sort of phenomenological approach to embodiment that's also informed by the empirical sciences. We call it the naturalization of phenomenology. This seems like a project that's a little bit more than paradoxical because phenomenology is originally constituted as a suspension of the natural sciences and the naive metaphysical attitude that they presuppose. At this point, it remains unclear whether the naturalization of phenomenology would mean the end of phenomenology or the end of the ideology that motivates the theological wing of phenomenology. It's not clear. Okay, so part of the problem is seems to be that phenomenology has become, like I said, so diffuse or so diluted that its methodology seems no longer relevant to the practice of phenomenology. I'm trying to skip a little bit here. I'm trying to be faithful to phenomenology by going very step by step, slowly, in my description of phenomenology. So I think I'm trying to be careful with my terms and trying to make myself clear. So yeah. Okay, so this section about phenomenology is coming to an end, and very, very soon, I promise. So my claim at the end of the day that phenomenology is not a method or a position that a realist should be taking up. Now, when you get to somebody like Merleau-Ponty, or you get to the turn to the body in phenomenology, which is already there in Husserl, there's this idea that when you start talking of the body, that you somehow are a little closer to being a materialist, or a little closer to being a realist. But my claim is that if you're doing phenomenology, the phenomenological method keeps you from being a realist. I've already said this. But even when you talk about the body, just because you talk about the body does not mean that you talk about reality or you talk about materialism in the metaphysical sense. Okay, so this seems counterintuitive to anyone who's found a realist ally in the philosophy of embodiment. Skip this. Like I said, phenomenology gives us a kind of rhetoric of concreteness, a rhetoric of realism. It doesn't give us a realist philosophy, just a realist rhetoric. Okay, so I'll skip a little bit. I skip a whole page, one whole page. Okay, so my paper is not intended to police the doors or the boundaries of phenomenology because I'm concerned with the purity of phenomenology. Because I'm not a phenomenologist, I don't care if it's pure or not. But if you want to be a phenomenologist, I think you should be at least a little bit concerned with purity, and I'm just trying to make that point, and maybe it's a stupid point, but I've made it and it's too late to undo it. I'm not going to lament the recession of rigor in phenomenological texts. Now the joke. I'm not trying exhaustively to specify the sufficient conditions of phenomenological practice, nor am I trying to enumerate the criteria that qualify something as evidence in phenomenology. I'm not concerned with that. All that I maintain is that for a philosophical description or study or conclusion to count as phenomenological, that is, to mark it as different from empirical or speculative description, the description must take place within some form of methodological reduction that shifts the focus of description from the shifts the focus of description to the transcendental level, or at least some kind of quasi-transcendental level. This is what differentiates phenomenological description from an everyday mundane description. We'll skip this too. So, for phenomenology to be phenomenology, it has to have at least a suspension of the natural attitude or a kind of epoche, and the metaphysics that goes along with that suspension, a kind of objectivist, naturalist metaphysics. This suspension requires the phenomenologist to confine his or her investigations to the much derided subject-object correlation. The investigations must happen within the correlation. As Dan Zahavi puts it, this is a quote, "The reduction, in contrast to the epoche, is the term for our thematization of the correlation between subjectivity and world." So phenomenology happens, it thematizes the correlation of subjectivity and world, or consciousness and being, what have you, and it happens within this correlation. It's this confinement that lends phenomenology its transcendental flavor and makes it something more than everyday description. More than mere description, phenomenology describes the transcendental dimension of experience as it unfolds within experience itself. It's therefore more basic than the empirical, more philosophical than everyday description, and without at least some attention to the transcendental, whether this is interpreted as the uncovering of consciousness's essential structures, as in Husserl, or the return to pre-reflective experience in Merleau-Ponty, it becomes nearly impossible to see the philosophical value or understand the institutional influence of phenomenological description. If it's not at least in some sense transcendental, I can't see its philosophical value. Otherwise put, phenomenology must at least adhere to what Husserl called the principle of principles in Ideas, section 24, which dictates that direct intuition is the origin of knowledge and to be respected in its own authority, and necessarily entails the view, today we call this correlationism, that subject and object, consciousness and phenomena, thought and being are an inseparable binary pair. Okay, so I argue on this page that when you tell the history of 20th century philosophy, 20th century European philosophy, we refer to this, we tell this story about the end of metaphysics. The story about the end of metaphysics begins in a very important way with Husserlian phenomenology and this notion of the epoche, or the reduction. So that narrative about the end of metaphysics is tied to the belief that there is something called the epoche, there's something called the phenomenological reduction, and that's one of the ways to overcome metaphysics, to escape metaphysics. Yeah? And if phenomenology is nothing without this reduction, if it does not exist without the reduction, then we don't have an end of metaphysics with phenomenology, or we don't have the beginning of the end of metaphysics with phenomenology. And here I take sides with Eugen Fink and Leonard Lawler, who say The reduction is absolutely necessary for phenomenological research. I think this is true. That's the one thing that is absolutely necessary. I don't know what else is necessary, but this is the one thing. It's true that phenomenology today is full of accounts of the excesses of being, the excesses of the phenomena. Here I'm thinking of Marion's saturated phenomena, Levinas's holy other, as well as Merleau-Ponty's claim that the reduction is impossible because of the excess, right, of reality, of the world. Here I take sides with a philosopher named Alexander Schnell, a German philosopher, when he argues that the excesses of phenomenology are always internal to intentionality. The excess happens within or is relative to the correlation that phenomenology insists upon. Right? It's not evidence. The excesses of the phenomena are not the excesses of phenomenology or the excesses that phenomenology uncovers or finds. Right? This is not evidence of some sort of autonomous reality that lies beyond phenomena. It doesn't get us to realism. It doesn't get us to materialism. Phenomenologists like to talk about the way that things resist us, right? But this resistance is relative to the correlation, right? It's a kind of experience of the world that they claim gives us indication that the world is more than what human beings experience. But it's not enough just to feel the resistance of the world to get you materialism. Okay? So I think phenomenology is presented with a choice. I have 1 page left, 1.5 pages. Right? Phenomenology is forced into a choice. Either it can prepare the groundwork for the end of metaphysics by sticking to its insistence on the necessity of the phenomenological reduction, or it can make itself compatible with metaphysical realism. It cannot do both things at once. It can't be a strict phenomenological, you can't have a strict phenomenological method and be a metaphysical realist as a phenomenologist. I think the reduction, insofar as it has a kind of transcendental element to it, right, prevents phenomenology from being realist, which is not to say that there isn't something called transcendental realism. I just don't think phenomenology is a transcendental realism in a kind of robust metaphysical sense. So either phenomenology brings metaphysics to an end and forecloses the possibility of a realist metaphysics, or allows a kind of return of metaphysics in order to accommodate certain theological or other aspirations. But then it can no longer be the harbinger of metaphysics' demise. However it conceives itself methodologically will inevitably betray its preference for one side of the dilemma or the other. Okay, let me just say a few things about speculative realism and we'll finish. So today it's still believed that phenomenology can get us back in touch with the real. Since we are told realism is just as outdated as idealism, and both of them are in principle absurd, as Husserl puts it, the closest thing to realism that we have on offer, I think, is phenomenology, or so we think. That is, phenomenology, when properly disengaged from Husserl's brand of Kantianism, has converted to something like existential phenomenology, and this is the closest thing that we can get to the real. I think this is a myth. The belief that phenomenology gets us realism instead of a modified form of idealism or correlationism results from a misunderstanding of the internal relation between the method and the metaphysics of phenomenology. No matter how it's interpreted, phenomenology can only align itself with anti-realism. So, what do the various materialisms and realisms associated with the speculative turn in continental philosophy have that phenomenology does not? In a word, they have speculation. Right? They have speculation. The speculation is tied to various methods. Right? Maybe some of the methods are successful, maybe they're not. I think Pete has a good critique of one of those methods, Harman's method, which is very closely aligned in a lot of ways with phenomenology. So maybe that's bad speculation. I'm not sure, right? But speculation is precisely the activity denounced by Kant's critical philosophy and explicitly prohibited by phenomenology. It's commonplace nowadays to point to the rejection or radicalization of correlationism as the move that marks a philosophical position as speculative in this new sense. It's commonplace for good reason as well. The anti-realism entailed by correlationism, which is oriented continental philosophy at least since Kant, and quite self-consciously in the 20th century, is precisely what is spurned by those working in the new metaphysics. We can, however, characterize the new metaphysics, speculative realism included, in a different way in terms of its commitments, right? Its commitments. If phenomenology is committed to metaphysical neutrality and to a species of correlationism that legitimates only those statements that are evidence from within the subject-object correlate, that is, within the reduction, then the new metaphysics begins with a commitment to the existence of a non-human or an inhuman reality outside of the subject-object correlate. Right? So it's a matter of commitment. What are you committed to? It then dedicates itself, speculative philosophy, dedicates itself to thinking, describing, demonstrating, if possible, and unleashing that reality. Speculative philosophy, moreover, does not restrict itself methodologically to a particular region of research as phenomenology does. Whatever one may think of the arguments for realism, it cannot be said that they put themselves a priori in the bind that phenomenology does. This does not mean that anything goes for speculative philosophy, but that the range of its metaphysical commitments are totally up for grabs in a much wider sense than it is for correlationist philosophy. It's less about limitation and more about proliferation. Okay, I'm done.